Sunny's Diner sat like a beacon on the corner of 5th and Main, its neon sign flickering in the dull gray of a cloudy afternoon. The diner was a relic of another time, with its 1950s-style decor, checkered tile floors, and faded red booths. Despite the worn-out appearance, it was the kind of place that offered familiarity and warmth to anyone who walked through its doors. Rachel Turner, a 24-year-old waitress, adjusted her apron as she glanced at the clock above the counter. The afternoon lull was settling in, leaving the diner quiet, except for the occasional clatter of a coffee cup or the low hum of the jukebox in the corner. Rachel had been working here for 2 years, long enough to know every creak in the floorboards and every regular customer's quirks. "Hey, Rachel," called Mrs. Carter, an elderly woman who came in every afternoon for her slice of cherry pie. "When are you going to let me set you up with my grandson?" Rachel chuckled, pouring coffee into the woman's cup. "Not today, Mrs. Carter. But keep trying. You might wear me down one of these days." Mrs. Carter winked. "Oh, I will." Rachel's days at Sunny's were filled with these small, pleasant moments. Though the work was hard, she enjoyed the sense of community the diner provided. It wasn't just a job to her. It was a place where people shared their stories, their laughter, and sometimes their heartbreaks. The first raindrops of the afternoon began to patter against the windows as a young man stepped inside the diner. His entrance was tentative, as though he wasn't sure he was welcome. His clothes were old and threadbare, his shoes caked with mud. His face was pale, framed by unkempt hair that hinted at weeks, if not months, of neglect. Rachel noticed him immediately. He stood near the door, his eyes darting around the room. She could see the hesitation in his posture, the way his hands fidgeted in his pockets. Taking a deep breath, Rachel stepped forward, offering him a kind smile. "Hi there," she said warmly. "Looking for a place to sit? Anywhere you like?" The man blinked at her, surprised by her tone. After a moment, he nodded and shuffled to a booth by the window. He didn't pick up the menu or take off his jacket. Instead, he stared out at the rain, his hands clasped tightly on the table. Rachel approached him with her notepad in hand. "What can I get you?" He hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't have any money." Rachel felt a pang of sadness as she looked at him. "That's okay," she said gently. "How about a cup of coffee to start? It's on me." The man glanced up at her, his eyes wide with gratitude. "Really? Really?" Rachel replied. "One coffee, coming right up." She moved behind the kaninsiya. Grabbing the mandiya. Freshest pot of coffee. As she poured the steaming liquid into a ceramic cup, she noticed her boss, Mr. Simmons, watching her from the kitchen doorway. His stern expression made her stomach tighten, but she shook it off. Carrying the cup back to the table, she set it down carefully. "Here you go," she said. "Take your time." The man wrapped his hands around the cup, as though trying to soak in its warmth. "Thank you," he murmured. Rachel gave him a reassuring smile. "I'll be right back." Rachel returned to the kitchen, where the smell of sizzling bacon and buttered toast filled the air. Ignoring Mr. Simmons's glare, she plated a simple meal of scrambled eggs, toast, and a side of bacon. She knew the diner's policy on unpaid meals, but her conscience wouldn't let her send this man back into the rain with an empty stomach. She carried the plate to his table and set it down gently. "Here you go. Hope you like it." The man looked at the food, his hands trembling slightly. I can't pay for this." "Don't worry about it," Rachel said. "Just eat. You look like you need it." For a moment, he simply stared at her, his expression a mix of disbelief and gratitude. Then, he picked up the fork and began to eat, taking small, deliberate bites as though savoring every morsel. Rachel slid into the booth across from him, resting her elbows on the table. "What's your name?" He hesitated before answering. "Ethan." "Nice to meet you, Ethan. I'm Rachel." Ethan nodded, his focus still on the plate. After a few minutes, he set the fork down and looked up at her. "Why are you doing this?" Rachel shrugged. "Because everyone deserves kindness, and because I've been where you are." Ethan's eyes widened. "You have?" Rachel nodded. "Not exactly like you, but close enough. Sometimes we just need someone to believe in us, even for a moment." Her words seemed to touch something deep within him. He set the fork down and took a deep breath. "I wasn't always like this," he began. As Ethan spoke, his words came out haltingly at first, like a faucet that hadn't been turned on in years. But as Rachel listened, her calm, attentive presence encouraged him to continue. "I grew up in a small town," he said, his voice low. "It was just me and my mom. She worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat. We didn't have much, but we were happy." He paused, staring down at his coffee. "Then when I was 17, she got sick. Cancer. It was fast, aggressive. I dropped out of school to take care of her. Worked nights at a gas station to pay for her treatments." Rachel felt a lump form in her throat but stayed silent, letting him continue. "When she died," Ethan said, his voice cracking, "I didn't know what to do. I tried to move on, but it felt like everything was gone. My home, my purpose, her." Ethan described how he moved to the city, hoping for a fresh start. But without a degree or connections, jobs were hard to come by. The few he managed to get never lasted long, and before he knew it, he was evicted from his apartment. "I've been living on the streets for almost a year now," he said, his hands tightening around the coffee cup. "I never thought it could happen to me, but it did." Rachel's chest ached with empathy. "Ethan, I'm so sorry," she said. "That's a lot for anyone to go through." Ethan shrugged. "It is what it is. But today's the first time in a long time that someone's treated me like a person. So, thank you." Unbeknownst to Rachel, her boss, Mr. Simmons, had been watching the entire interaction. As Ethan finished his meal and stood to leave, Simmons stormed out from the kitchen, his face red with anger. "Rachel!" he barked, his voice loud enough to make the few remaining customers turn their heads. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Rachel stood, her heart pounding. "I was helping someone who needed it." "Helping?" Simmons snapped. "This is a business, not a charity. You think I can keep the lights on by giving away free food?" Rachel clenched her fists, struggling to stay calm. "It was one meal, Mr. Simmons. He was hungry, and he needed help." "That's not your decision to make," Simmons said coldly. "If you're so eager to give things away, maybe you should find a job where that's acceptable. You're fired." Rachel stared at him, disbelief and anger flooding her chest. "Fired? For showing compassion?" "This isn't up for discussion," Simmons said. "Pack your things and get out." Rachel stood frozen, her ears ringing with the word fired. Her cheeks burned with a mix of anger and humiliation as she glanced around the diner. The remaining customers sat awkwardly, pretending not to listen but stealing sympathetic glances her way. Ethan, standing nearby, looked mortified. "This is my fault," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I shouldn't have come in here." Rachel shook her head firmly. "No, Ethan. This isn't on you, it's on him," she said, her voice steady, despite the lump forming in her throat. You needed help, and I'm glad I was here to give it to you." Mr. Simmons rolled his eyes. "Spare me the speech. Rachel, you've got 10 minutes to pack up your things and leave, and take your charity case with you." Ethan's face turned red, but Rachel grabbed his arm before he could respond. "It's not worth it," she said softly. Turning back to Simmons, she added, "I'll go, but I hope one day you understand that kindness is more important than profit." As she untied her apron and grabbed her belongings, the door to the diner opened. A man in a tailored suit walked in, his sharp features and confident stride exuding authority. He paused briefly, taking in the tense atmosphere before making his way to the counter. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "Is there a manager here I can speak to?" Simmons perked up, his scowl quickly replaced with a customer service smile. "That would be me. How can I help you?" The man didn't return the smile. Instead, he gestured toward Rachel and Ethan. "I'd like to discuss how you've handled this situation." The man introduced himself as Samuel Harris, the mayor of the city. His presence immediately shifted the room's energy. Customers sat up straighter, and even Simmons seemed momentarily thrown off. "Mayor Harris," Simmons stammered, attempting to regain his composure. "This is just a minor issue with one of my employees. Nothing to concern yourself with." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "From where I'm standing, it looks like more than a minor issue. I watched the way you berated this young woman for showing compassion to someone in need." Simmons flushed, his earlier confidence faltering. "Well, sir, this is a business. We can't afford to—" Samuel held up a hand, silencing him. "I understand that businesses need to make a profit, but they also have a responsibility to their community. Firing someone for feeding a hungry person doesn't align with the values this city stands for." Rachel watched in stunned silence, her heart pounding. She had never expected anyone to stand up for her, let alone the mayor himself. Samuel turned to Rachel, his expression softening. "Miss, may I have a word with you outside?" She nodded, clutching her bag tightly as she followed him out of the diner. Ethan trailed behind, unsure of what to do, but unwilling to leave Rachel's side. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening under the streetlights. Samuel turned to Rachel, his eyes kind but serious. "I couldn't help but overhear what happened in there," he said. "And I have to say, I'm impressed by your courage and kindness." Rachel blinked, unsure how to respond. "Thank you, sir, but it doesn't feel very courageous right now." Samuel smiled faintly. "Courage doesn't always feel like courage in the moment, but your actions today demonstrate exactly the kind of compassion this city needs." He glanced at Ethan, who stood a few steps away, looking unsure of himself. "And you," Samuel said, addressing him directly. "I want you to know that you're not invisible. Your story matters, and there are people who want to help." Ethan looked down, his voice barely audible. "Thank you." Samuel turned back to Rachel. "I'm the founder of a program called the City Hope Initiative. It's a network of social centers dedicated to helping individuals and families in crisis, providing meals, shelter, job training, and other resources." Rachel's eyes widened. She had heard of the initiative but had never imagined being part of it. "We're always looking for people who embody the values we stand for," Samuel continued. "If you're interested, I'd like to offer you a position at one of our centers. It won't be easy work, but I think you're exactly the kind of person we need." Rachel felt a lump rise in her throat. After the humiliation she had just endured, this unexpected kindness was overwhelming. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Absolutely," Samuel said. "Compassion is a rare quality, and you've shown it in abundance." Rachel glanced at Ethan, who gave her an encouraging nod. Turning back to Samuel, she straightened her shoulders. "I'd be honored," she said. Rachel's first day at the City Hope Center was a whirlwind of activity. The building was a sprawling facility with a dining hall, classrooms, and a dormitory for temporary housing. Everywhere she looked, there were people, volunteers, staff members, and individuals seeking assistance. Her supervisor, Linda Perez, welcomed her warmly. "We're thrilled to have you on board, Rachel," she said. "Your story has already inspired a lot of us." Rachel spent the day shadowing Linda, learning how the center operated. She helped serve meals in the dining hall, sorted clothing donations, and sat in on a job training workshop. By the end of the day, her feet ached, and her head was spinning with new information. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was making a real difference. A week later, Rachel was working in the dining hall when she spotted a familiar face. Ethan had walked through the doors, his shoulders hunched and his expression hesitant. "Ethan," she called, rushing over to him. He smiled sheepishly. "Hi, Rachel. I didn't know you worked here." "I just started," she said. "Come on, let me show you around." As she guided him through the center, Ethan's posture began to relax. He signed up for several programs, including a job training course and a temporary housing placement. Over the next few months, Rachel and Ethan saw each other frequently. She watched as he regained his confidence and began to rebuild his life. Years later, Rachel stood in front of a packed auditorium, addressing a crowd at the annual City Hope Gala. She had risen through the ranks to become the center's director, her journey a testament to the power of compassion and resilience. "Kindness isn't just an act," she said, her voice steady. "It's a ripple that spreads, touching lives in ways we can't always see. I'm standing here today because someone gave me a chance when I needed it most, and I hope to do the same for others." In the audience, Ethan sat in the front row, now a successful advocate for homelessness prevention. As he clapped, he couldn't help but think back to that rainy afternoon at Sunny's Diner. The day one small act of kindness had changed both of their lives forever.